Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, and tonight I'll be talking about the pros and cons of curiosity and considering an example of applied curiosity, which in this case will have to do with comedy and comedians. But before we get into that, please check to confirm that you are still subscribed. YouTube is furiously shaving off my subscribers. And keep in mind, you can follow this channel and the alternate channel, A Safer Space, over on BitChute. And there's Minds, there's Gab, there's Twitter, there's a Discord server. Those who wish to support the channel can do so through GoFundMe and Subscribestar. Thanks to all of those who already do. Links for everything I just mentioned are down in the description box below. So, we'll be talking about what's been characterized as the sin of curiositas, which is understood as a seeking after useless and vain knowledge, profane knowledge. It is a sin of excess inquisitiveness. But I suspect it's about excess, maybe more than it is about curiosity itself. After all, every sin lies in excess, so we shouldn't be too quick to reject curiosity in and of itself. If we wish to consider whether curiosity is virtuous or vicious, we have to take into account the flip side of excess curiosity. We have to include the sin of indifference in our reckoning. We have to include disinterest and insensibility in our considerations. Being impervious to new perspectives is the other half of curiosity. It's a kind of blindness. The old word for those who suffer this condition, by the by, is caecos, a Latin word meaning the blind. At any rate, why don't people wonder more about these things, about anything, about things in general, or notice and then act on those niggling little questions that appear in their minds? Why do they rely to such a great extent on pre-digested content, on no assembly required outlooks and perspectives, ways of viewing the world that most of us not only never truly examine, but don't even recognize we've adopted? To become more curious, to fight against stupid indifference, against stultifying disinterest, is something you have to work at daily. I discussed one way of training sensitivity to new ideas and insights at some length in a clip I did in the Esoterica series called Inspiration. I'll put a link to it at the end of this video. So there are many ways to develop the kind of alert perceptual dilation, the kind of proactive curiosity I'm talking about. If you're already in on the secret, you'll come across new methods and techniques all the time. But it doesn't come naturally to everyone, or if it does, it's in specific ways that have to do with their personal interest areas, like carpenters who walk into a house and, they can't stop themselves from noticing everything fucked up about it. Or root women who can see that plants are suffering from roots that are too wet. Or mechanics who artfully read the signs of wear that others would never even know to look for. Turning wrenches, greasy paws. They know how to see things in an engine that most people don't. That's how most people focus their attention on these little things, maintaining an open mind, an open perception to what might come in. So let's take an example of curiosity in action. Is it vicious? Or is it virtuous to the extent that it can expose vice? For our example, let's look at words. Let's look at rhetoric the same way a mechanic looks at parts in an engine or a gardener scrutinizes flower bulbs. And let's see how remaining open to novel ideas, how looking at old words with new eyes can lead to greater insights about the things in the world that those words designate. Let's start with the word comic, or rather the word comedian, which should denote an entertainer who makes the audience laugh. But in looking at most comedians lately, I find that they don't make me laugh. This is where most people would stop thinking about it, I'll be honest. The explanation would be simple. They're simply not funny. They're bad comedians. They don't really make people laugh. But that is not how my mind works. Whether curiositas is a virtue or a vice, the fact remains that I've got it bad. I have to keep thinking about it. I have to keep chewing on it. And so I arrived at the following formulation. If they're not comedians, then what the hell are they? So I think about it a bit, and then I go to the thesaurus, as I so often do. People really don't know how incredibly useful a good thesaurus can be. They're actually genuine grimoires filled with arcane knowledge. So anyway, I look up comic, and I find words like satirized and lampooner. But that's still not quite the right word for what most so-called comedians really are these days. But then I get into a rich vein of associations. I find detractor, decrier, disparager, slighter, despiser, cynic, mocker, scoffer, castigator, denouncer. Fine-tuning the concepts through the act of fine-tuning the word choice helps me to bring the reality of the situation into sharper focus. But we're not all the way there yet, because it's not just about denunciation and slander. These so-called comedians oftentimes do still somehow manage to make people laugh, even if I myself don't even crack a smile. Not once when I'm listening to them. So what's all that about? People are laughing, aren't they? Well, once upon a time, a comedian would choose just a few people from the audience, one or two in an evening, and they would pick on them. But the audience would usually see it as being well-deserved because, those same people usually brought it down on themselves in some fashion by saying some kind of stupid shit. But what's happening today is more about the entire audience being treated like those few assholes who interrupt the show. The ones that comedians always come down on hard. It provides all sorts of opportunities. They're often plants. Anyway, it's always oblique. It's always an oblique threat for the entire audience, an implied threat that something might come down on them. I guess I should explain, what is the threat? The threat that some class of people will be mocked. And who is most likely to be mocked? Well, if my experience of human nature is any guide, particularly my time as a child, the things most likely to be mocked are stupidity, poverty, overly low or overly high social status, lack of education, vanity and self-importance, sticking out in some kind of way in front of the herd, that sort of thing. But now the objective is cultural balkanization and the inculcation of reflexive, neurotic self-doubt. And the wedges are driven between identitarian categories. Focusing on a bad apple here or there these days is little more than a kind of camouflage, a way of hiding what's really happening, which is that whole categories of the audience are being taken to task based on their gender or race. As a result, the whole audience is sitting there waiting for their group to become the object of mockery and abuse. And all of this together amounts to a kind of regular conditioning. But we don't have to go into all that. It's implied. So think about nervous laughter. Think about church laughter, the laughter of released tension. There's actually a fair amount of psychological literature on the subject of nervous laughter, and I commend it to all of your attention. It may well have something to do with why it is that these so-called comedians who aren't funny, with their implied threat of public ridicule, are making people laugh. Laughter that comes from knowing someone else has been targeted, the laughter of relief, the laughter that comes from fear that then finds some outlet. Most of us have probably seen a father that threatens the baby, you know, and the baby looks scared for a second and then breaks into laughter. The laughter that comes from realizing the threat was escaped, or that the threat was unreal in the first place. Given that we experience that sense of relief through laughter, it seems reasonable to assert that the tension being created and manipulated by the so-called comics working today arises from the threat of shaming, the threat of mockery and public ridicule. Then we laugh when we dodge the bullet, when the misfortune befalls someone else, when the putative comedian reveals that the audience can slip free in the end in some surprising way. This suggests to me that the word bully is appropriate here. Extortionist, perhaps? Remember, the question is, if they're not comedians, what are they? What are they? Or maybe nag. Nag really fits quite well, given the whole poisoned anima aspect, swollen with purple venom that seems to be a distinct element of the cultural dislocations we're currently dealing with. So let's call them nags. I mean, after all, why shouldn't we? They threaten through persistent fault-finding, through hypocritical virtue displays and threats of public shaming. They're nags. They're cry bullies who harp on relentlessly, who badger and harass, who henpeck and harry. Nags are, of course, closely related to scolds. And what's the distinguishing feature of the scold, of the gossip? Those who have dealt with the evil machinations of nags, scolds, and gossips will readily tell you that it's the harm they do to individuals and communities, which they drive wedges into and splinter, driven as they are by envy and resentment. That's why once upon a time they were publicly punished. They are scolds, and the scold's bridle, or branks, is the only solution. I won't go into all of that here, but all of you should do a search for branks, B-R-A-N-K-S. And for scold's bridle, an image search will show you an assortment of the masks that convicted scolds were forced to wear in punishment. Go and have a look. The fact that communities created such punishments just goes to show you that they took the threat posed by nags and scolds very seriously. It was well known that when allowed to get out of hand, they rip families and communities apart. All this with the sowing of discord is tied to a particular kind of destructive, feminine weaponization of speech, which is of course not limited to women, I will note. This in turn has mythical association with witches, the evil eye said to dry creatures up, the idea of a baleful gaze that causes genuine misfortune, that ruins crops and leaves wombs barren, that dries up the most fertile gardens, a blistering glare of envy and resentment, linking in turn to the vice of invidia, of envy. Is it mere coincidence that this witchery has entered our so-called comedy at the same time women are more common among comics? Amy Schumer, Sarah Silverman, Kathy Griffin, Ellen DeGenerate, Samantha Bee. Villagers from times past would immediately recognize that invidious witchery was being practiced upon them. They would see it immediately. Freud had never been born, and so he'd never read Nietzsche closely, nor had he had the chance to have relations with poor Nietzsche's Beatrice, the much-desired Lou Andreas Salome, and so he hadn't cobbled together psychoanalysis from the crumbs Nietzsche had left behind for him, and so they didn't have any way to psychologically describe what those so-called witches were doing, those poor villagers. But does this mean they were wrong? Or that they were superstitious fools? Granting that they doubtless killed people for no good reason from time to time, and that witch burning has happily been discontinued in the West, given that it's a barbarous practice. Taking all of that as granted, is it not possible that some of the time these villagers were correctly identifying a thing that was actually being done, and were only limited by their vocabulary and their education in how they could characterize it? Is it possible that for all intents and purposes, witches casting spells to wreak havoc in the community was a perfectly accurate description? And what did they do with such people? Well, we know what they did with witches, so let's not get involved in all of that. As I said, I don't endorse that sort of behavior. But have a look at how they dealt with the less malignant manifestations of all of this. How they dealt with witchy Scolds, who were making a nuisance of themselves and beginning to cause real trouble in the community. Again, go look up Branks and Scolds Bridal on YouTube. You'll enjoy it. And all of this will, I hope, cause you to look with new eyes upon so-called comedy you might see. With any luck, you'll hear all the so-called jokes with new ears. And that's leaving aside all the other facets of this same scolding and witchery, which we can identify operating in parallel with the so-called comedy. Concern trolling is one. A bent, black, and poisonous iron knife they'll be happy to stick directly into your back at work, at school, or even in many families. There are many others which we don't have time to go into now. Before I bring this to a close, I should underline my point and bring all this back full circle for you. What is the meta nugget, ladies and gentlemen? What is the overarching lesson we can carry away from all of this? Is it not that curiositas is not always a vice? In fact, even in the midst of vice, it can yield insights which are delightfully entertaining, and which in any case must form the basis of any understanding of how to address these problems. Naming the demon yields power over it, which is why so many of the Scrabble-Babble rearrangers of letters have focused upon systematic misnaming as a way to hide their nefarious activities. And so I leave you with one last idea for your consideration. The idea of the great renaming. For we have entered this time, and it is up to those of us who read signs to begin the renaming. Those of us who can recognize the misnomers, the willful introduction of disinformation, the passive lies of wordplay being counterfeited into the collective medium of our shared language. Once, while reflecting, I heard myself say, and I said to myself, I see and I say, that's my way. Each of you has this within you as well, to a greater or lesser extent. And so perhaps you might indulge in a little curiositas from time to time. Remain open and receptive rather than mired in leaden indifference, smothered by your own disinterest. Look around you. Look at what has been misnamed around you, including these misnamed comedians and comics, and rename them as what they are. Scolds and Nags, sowers of discord and strife, hateful witches, black-eyed and jaundiced, marbled through with the sickly, syrupy purple and yellow of envy. When it comes to naming such as these, that act, their very renaming, is the first act of justice. Get it? Got it? Good. Semiagog out.